Resident Evil 3 is a fun, action-oriented departure from its sister game, Resident Evil 2. Despite the tonal shift, Resident Evil 3 will keep your heart pumping and, depending on your tolerance, will provide a few scares. Undoubtedly, many will reference it to Resident Evil 2, as it seems they were intended to be companion games. But the methodology utilized to create each is vastly different and has inadvertently highlighted the identity issues the series has had all along. I too will occasionally reference Resident Evil 2 during the course of this review for contrast, but will avoid any story spoilers for either game. I'm Ross Magas, this is Not Real Life, and this is my review for Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3 starts up in Jill's apartment. After surviving the nightmare of the mansion incident and dealing with her own literal nightmares, Jill's Valentine receives a weird phone call from teammate Brad Vickers about an imminent threat. You never see it coming. Managing to escape, she discovers there is a mass T-virus outbreak and heads to an evacuation site at a nearby parking garage. Only two. Damn. She is saved by Carlos.
I'm fine.
Personal space.
A UBCS
Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service
squad agent sent in to evacuate survivors, where she meets squad leader Mikhail Victor. Mikhail recognizes her.
Something, Valentine. You didn't even think to ask fine young lady her name?
All right.
And asks for assistance.
My men cannot do this alone.
Right. How's that going for you?
Thank you, Jill.
Okay.
She reluctantly agrees and then launches on her new path to escape the city that involves her in more than just an impromptu rescue operation. But it's okay, because, as she says,
I've got this.
I know you do.
The story of Resident Evil 3 is relatively straightforward. Most things that are brought up are addressed in the story later via dialogue, cutscenes, or with the various diaries and documents laying about.
Dude!
There are a few things that do not really go anywhere or get any substantial resolution.
Oh no, don't care.
Ballsy motherfucker.
The best I can tell is that some of these were notable events in the original, but appear to have lost a lot in translation. From what I've heard, there have been massive cuts to the story in comparison to the original. However, even if you're not familiar with the original, you will still be able to enjoy this version, but as previously mentioned, you may notice a few odd things here and there. Resident Evil 4 is the first Resident Evil game I really played, so you would be in a similar situation to me, with this being the first time introduction to what happened at this point in the RE story. For those curious, Resident Evil 3 takes place right before Resident Evil 2. Incidentally, it is revealed that Jill is related to Nathan Drake and Lara Croft. Oh. Whoa! Ah! You never see it coming. Nemesis's new design and a lot of posters are clearly referencing movies like Terminator and Alien. So much that it seems like his redesign is affected by those movies. There's even a cafe named after Sigourney Weaver. It turns out that the actor who plays Mikhail was a character in Aliens, and this was done as an homage to his past. While that is cool and all, I'm not sure why it's in a Resident Evil game, or why it's not a reference to his character, but it seems a bit tone deaf to the fans of the franchise who came from Resident Evil, but were greeted with, "Hey, aren't these other things cool?"
Shut up!
Personally, I would have preferred more posters that reference Capcom's history. There are a few things in-game that do this, but with such a rich backlog of games, it seems they could have done a lot more with that. But that's just a personal preference. Resident Evil 3 is very dark, almost unreasonably dark, not in subject matter, but literally dark.
This is advanced darkness.
Do not feel bad that you may have to adjust the brightness. My first playthrough was on the default settings, and after that I brightened it up. Sometimes the settings make it so dark that I'm not sure if it's fair to say that things are hidden, but rather that they are almost invisible. While dark lighting typically does lend itself to creating the horror atmosphere, it can be distracting to have to check the map only to see the item you are looking for is right in front of you. This made it difficult to play the game when there was any amount of ambient light. This may be the way my TV displays blacks, but is easily rectified in the menus. As far as atmosphere goes, Resident Evil 3 has a lot of tension, but not so much horror. This may be the result of having larger open spaces versus cramped corridors, but this tone seems to permeate more than just the visual and auditory parts of the game. The modified tank controls return, and controlling Jill does not feel sluggish or heavy. Shooting zombies is fun, and critical shots now have an added effect that fills the screen, making it impossible not to notice. That being said, you may hate the visual effect as critical hits often result in a zombie's head exploding, which is also hard to miss. A huge departure from Resident Evil 2 takes place here in that all the sub-weapons are no longer categorized separately. So, if you want quick access to your knife, it will need to take a slot that may be otherwise occupied by another weapon. The weapons that were classified as sub-weapons are the combat knife and grenades. However, unlike in Resident Evil 2, Jill's knife does not break, but you can't use it as a way to break a zombie grapple. This is true of grenades as well. Another change from the base mechanics in Resident Evil 2 is a new override of sorts that has been added. While I am not certain the exact conditions to trigger it, this takes place when you are in combat. Oh! Whoa! Whoa! What is going on with these grenades? To the best of my knowledge, the override is based on proximity and how quickly an enemy is approaching you. What happens is as follows. You'll be aiming at the enemy in question, X condition occurs, and your character will stop aiming to run backwards even though you are still holding the inputs for aim. The only way I've been able to stop this override of the controls is to stop completely and then take aim again. I found this mechanic to be very frustrating, as what I expected to happen was to take shots as I walk backwards slowly, only to have the character react in a way I do not want, which has caused its fair share of deaths and panic. This does not happen all the time, but it does happen enough that I noticed it and was frustrated by it. The big new addition to combat is the dodge roll. Jill has the ability to sidestep in any of the 4 cardinal directions. How far and how she moves is affected by the direction she is facing and the direction you input. By pressing R1 and an input, Jill will duck in the direction of the input. This can be done, it seems, up to 3 times consecutively without attacks. Keep in mind, Jill will be vulnerable during the recovery animation if you mess up, and you can dodge into an oncoming enemy. Ooh. Whoa! If done right, however, Jill will roll and activate a bullet time mechanic during which you can aim and she will auto-lock onto the enemy's weak point. According to the game, the dodge can be activated in 2 ways, the way I just explained, or by drawing your weapon at the right time. Note this was not explained when the game introduces the mechanic, but was shown to me much later in one of those loading screen tips. Keep in mind you are not invulnerable during bullet time. I mentioned previously that this can be done up to 3 times without attacks, but I'm not sure how many times you can do this consecutively if you correctly activate the dodge. Also keep in mind that you do not simply get invincibility frames at the beginning of the dodge either. If you are being charged head on by a zombie and dodge into it, you will get caught. This is in contrast with Carlos, as the dodge is replaced with a shoulder tackle. If you are able to time your tackle correctly, Carlos follows up with a huge haymaker Chris Redfield style and knocks down the offending party, allowing you to get extra damage while they are down. Light crafting elements return, giving you the option to craft certain ammo types and combine herbs for better health recovery. Depending on your difficulty setting, it is clear that the developers may intend for you to craft more of a certain type of ammo than others, but this does allow for a certain amount of personalization. Herbs, on the other hand, have seen a reduction in their complexity and have removed the variety of herbs present from the other Resident Evil games. Blue herbs present in Resident Evil 2 and the yellow herbs from Resident Evil 4 do not return in this game, and only the green and red ones remain. The 3-tier health system returns, and if you're playing on PlayStation, you have the added benefit of the light bar changing color to indicate what state you are at. For those unfamiliar, the early Resident Evil games use a system where your health was indicated as either fine, caution, or danger. Depending on the difficulty and the enemy, this is somewhere between 1 to 5 hits before your character will die. You can check your health on the inventory screen at any time, and for us PlayStation users, you can check the light on your controller. Green herbs restore 1 level of health, whereas a combination of green and red or 3 green will give you max health. Besides herbs, you can also find first aid sprays which restore your health to maximum regardless of damage. For the speed demons out there, cutscenes and most radio conversations can be skipped. However, some cannot be skipped, and this may be due to loading a section in the background. The level design in Resident Evil 3 takes a different path than that in Resident Evil 2. Where Resident Evil 2 focused on non-linear paths to accomplish set objectives in a smaller, more convoluted location, Resident Evil 3 has taken a different route. While it does start out with an open area, it ultimately chooses not to embrace it as much as its predecessor. Key items appear to be strategically placed to minimize backtracking, as they are placed along progression points. And once you hit certain points, you will no longer be able to return to previous areas. Another huge departure from the Resident Evil franchise in general is the lack of puzzles. Resident Evil 3 has one in the endgame section. Safes return as well, however finding the codes is much easier, especially since the safes share, in part, the same combination. This may be a coincidence, but take it how you will. I suppose Capcom must have gotten feedback against puzzles, but personally, I enjoy them. In lieu of this, Capcom appears to have chosen to insert action sequences and chase scenes that will surprise you the first time you come across them. For you at home, you can decide on your own if this is good or bad. Resident Evil 2 famously took advantage of the Resident Evil engine to showcase its unrealistic, realistic damage to great effect. You could see the damage on limbs and body parts of zombies, and it was really gross, in a good way. But it would seem the setting in Resident Evil 3 is a heavy lift on console resources, as the gore factor has been turned down a lot. Yes, as stated previously, critical headshots still result in explosions, and the occasional arm and leg will come off, but it is less than it was in the previous game. Depending on your tolerance or how sadistic you are to zombies, your mileage will vary on how much this matters. While this iteration of the game does not have the Nemesis brand on it, Capcom wastes no time in revealing his appearance to us. You'll be greeted by Nemesis even before you start the game, as he is the background image for the start screen. In gameplay, Nemesis cannot be killed, but he still takes damage. You can only temporarily stun him, and this is usually enough to get through the current section. He can freely roam sections of the map once he's revealed in the game's plot. Besides this, you will meet him in closed sections for either a boss fight or a chase sequence. Nemesis does not have a large repertoire of attacks, and depending on the difficulty, he augments this with increased speed and damage. There is really only one place Nemesis should really give you a hard time, and I'll touch on this later when I talk about difficulty. But you'll know it when you get there. It is not fun. If this is your first time playing, you may notice while you run around a distinct lack of any working storefronts, merchants,
What are you buying?
or even in-game currency. The store is not something you can access during your initial playthrough. Once you complete Resident Evil 3 once, you will unlock the shop, which is accessible from the game's main menu. By completing specific tasks or hitting certain milestones, you will be awarded points based on the task's difficulty. This is anywhere between 0 to thousands of points. Completing these tasks will also award you the ability to look at character models and concept art. These purchases cover a wide range of things, from infinite ammo weapons, items that deliver passive bonuses, to extra inventory space, and even in-game items you normally find.
I am,
Super cop.
and this is my
Rocket launcher!
She weighs 150 kilograms and fires $200 custom tool cartridges at 10,000 rounds per minute. It costs $400,000 to fire this weapon for 12 seconds. Cry some more.
The hard modes are trivialized by the in-game reward system. You can grind to get the infinite weapons and passive buffs and nullify the difficulty of the hard modes. So any new features or challenges presented by these modes is basically void. This is even true of the way achievements are set up in-game. The unlockable weapons do not disable the achievement trackers. In fact, one such feat that requires you to kill a number of enemies with the Lightning Hawk, a gun you only get at the end of the game, can be completed with an unlockable weapon that you get in the game shop. Inferno will likely be the only place you meet any real difficulty. This will mostly be due to Nemesis and the lack of autosave backing up your progress all the time. It can be frustrating to lose so much progress because of what feels like an unfair death. Try as best as you can to stay calm and go through as efficiently as possible. If you have not gotten the unlockables, then I suspect you may be in for quite a slog through this difficulty. Most enemies will probably kill you in an attack or two at most, but honestly, it is doable. This mode will test you if you hadn't bought the aforementioned gear, which makes this mode easy. But seeing as how they don't affect your ability to get the S rank on Inferno, I don't see why you wouldn't simply choose to do this. I do know that some out there will not get these items and still get an S rank to prove themselves. But I will wait and see if I want to do that some other time. Just be advised that Inferno mode will present an unfair difficulty spike in gameplay at a certain point. This will be due to certain conditions that I almost guarantee you will not have seen before this difficulty. This difficulty spike is so sudden that, let's just say that even with the unlockables, if you don't have the right ones, you're probably going to have a bad time. On Nightmare difficulty or higher, the placement of enemies and items is not the same as previous difficulties. One such notable difference is that you get the Lightning Hawk as soon as you make it to the first box in the train station. There is another notable difference that Carlos will experience in his sections that feels like it's not completely realized. And in the interest of remaining spoiler free, I will not be mentioning what that is here. Just know that I found it more confusing than entertaining. This, for me, was a personal loss. Mercenary mode was, as far as I knew, a staple of the series. As I entered the series with Resident Evil 4, I figured this was simply a part of the Resident Evil game. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Mercenaries, it is a timed score chasing mode that is typically unlocked once you complete the main campaign. Depending on the game, you have a set number of characters who are unlocked by either passing certain score thresholds, or they may simply be unlocked to begin with. Each character will have a different loadout to facilitate different playstyles. Not only are the weapons different, but typically characters will have different capabilities, and many, if not most, are characters who are not playable in the standard modes. This mode will easily add dozens, if not hundreds of hours to your playtime. Depending on the game, this mode also allows co-op and cooperative play locally or online. It also doesn't help that I discovered that the Mercenary mode originated in the original Resident Evil 3. It is likely that Capcom knew that Mercenaries would take away from Project Resistance and removed it as a result. I'm sure this will result in a bunch of people who probably didn't even boot up Project Resistance. At the time of this review, I have yet to try it. While on paper it sounds like these modes are similar, the key differences lie in that Mercenaries does not require other players to join in a game. So for those of you who live in areas with poor internet connection, or simply do not like to have your gameplay tied to others in asymmetric gameplay, you can still take advantage of Mercenaries with its potentially endless replay value. Resident Evil 3 is rock solid from a gameplay perspective. Running and gunning zombies feels fun and is not so simple that it lacks any charm. However, this may be too much for a game in the Resident Evil franchise, as some will undoubtedly find issue with the action-heavy tone. Ultimately, how much you like this game will come down to how familiar you are with the Resident Evil franchise as a whole. In my initial playthrough, I did think certain story beats were odd and wondered why certain things were included. But overall, I immensely enjoyed my action-packed ride through Raccoon City. However, the more I learned about the original game, its story and how it handled its characters, the more I wondered about how they landed on certain choices they made for this game. I won't go over any of it here, but just know that a lot of things seem to have gone cut. These things provide not only emotional ties to certain events, but context for why those events work in the first place. The characters in the current iteration will seem weird at times, but not in a game-breaking way, as you may think this is just typical Capcom ham and cheese. However, those of you familiar with the original games will see severely hampered character personalities changed to fit in this shorter attempt to modernize the narrative. This is apparently also true of Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 3 is definitely worth checking out. While it does fall short of being a masterclass in remaking a game from a bygone generation, the parts it does well it excels at. This game is fun, and personally I would recommend it as part of a Resident Evil dyad with Resident Evil 2. I think the best way to experience these games is to play them together, as they have an interconnected plot. Start with this game, then go on to Resident Evil 2, which will introduce you to a more horror-filled experience, as your characters are less capable from a gameplay perspective. Jill and Carlos have more options available to them than Leon and Claire do. This will allow you to experience both sides of the Resident Evil franchise and decide for yourself which aspects you would like better. As far as the number score for Resident Evil 3 goes, like I said, your mileage will vary. Depending on who you are, this game will be between a 6 and an 8 on most review platforms. Having not played the originals, I landed on the 8 side of things and maintain that as far as gameplay goes, this is an excellent game. However, on the narrative side of things, I'd say Resident Evil 3 scores lower, and that score will inevitably get worse the more you learn about the past. Thanks for watching my spoiler-free review of Resident Evil 3. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like so YouTube will share this video with others, subscribe for more content, and tap that bell to stay up to date. If you really liked this content, consider donating to my Patreon, link in the description. I'm Ross Magas, this is Not Real Life, and I'll see you guys in the next video.